Thank you very much. Want to start by thanking the World Maritime University as well as the Korean government for inviting me to speak today. Really honored to be here. As was said, my name is Benjamin Harkins, so I work on the EU-funded Ship-to-Shore Rights Southeast Asia program. We're an initiative covering Southeast Asia led by the International Labor Organization, but also implemented together with the International Organization for Migration and the FAO. So I wanted to speak a little bit today about the Work and Fishing Convention, C-188, as well as some other relevant international labor standards and guidelines for protection of fishers. So I will jump right in. I thought it was important to start with a little bit of context for what the issues we see in terms of labor migration and work in the fishing industry. I like to often start by presenting three numbers, which I think kind of sum up what we see as the very hazardous and often exploitative working conditions in the industry. The first one comes from the Fish Safety Foundation. And as was mentioned by Raphael, of course, the numbers are imperfect in the fishing industry. But the most comprehensive estimate that's been done as of late is that there are 100,000 deaths in the commercial fishing industry every year. And what is really striking about this number, not only the scale of it, but in fact, the study found many of those deaths were preventable if more attention was paid to occupational safety and health in the industry. The second number I want to present is that at any given time, there are about 128,000 fishers trapped in situations of forced labor in the fishing industry. That's from the global estimate of modern slavery that was done. And what we know is, in fact, that's a very conservative estimate. That's probably way too low. The ILO is developing new methodologies for estimating forced labor prevalence in fishing. It is quite unique, and you need more specialized methodologies. So hopefully we'll have a more comprehensive estimate in the future. The third number is that from that same estimate, migrants are 3 times more likely than nationals to be engaged in situations of forced labor. That's particularly important for the fishing industry because increasingly we see the workers in the fishing industry are migrants. Nationals don't want to do work that they see as dirty, dangerous, degrading work. So often it is migrants who are involved in the fishing industry. So why is it that we see these problems in the fishing industry? I like to say, the vulnerability, it's not a few bad apple employers and recruiters here that we're talking about. This is really structural vulnerability to abuse in the industry. And one key factor is indeed the globalization, the global economic structure that we have today, where if you're outsourcing production of seafood, that creates a lot of pressure on upstream suppliers and can lead to a race to the bottom on working conditions because, of course, they're trying to source it from the cheapest possible location. Another important factor here is restrictive migration governance. So as was mentioned by Raphael, if you have migrants whose employment is very tightly tied to one employer through their visas, through their work permits, it means they have a lot of trouble speaking up about abuses, and they can't necessarily leave those jobs because they can't just find another job. They would have to go home. So that creates a high level of vulnerability. Another one, and again, Raphael mentioned this, but fishers are often employed informally, and they're not covered by labor and social protection laws. And when you have those kinds of gaps in coverage of things like minimum wage coverage, set working hours, entitlement to social protection, it does mean migrants are more vulnerable to abuse. Migrant fishers are more vulnerable to abuse than other types of workers. And of course, we also have to mention that there are sort of sectoral specificities about work in fishing. which do increase the vulnerability of migrant fishers. Of course, isolated workplaces, they can't easily access assistance when they need it. Long and unpredictable work hours, of course, as we know, so they have to fish when the fish are available. Traditional pay systems, share of catch payments, for example, mean indeed fishers don't know exactly how much they're going to be paid necessarily. And indeed, also problems with unclear jurisdiction over who is responsible for regulating fishing, particularly if you're talking about work out on the high seas. So these are some numbers from the survey that Raphael mentioned earlier. If you look here, what you see is indeed about 1 in 5 migrant fishers in this big regional survey we did were found to be in situations of forced labor. And what I would stress here is, in fact, none of the flag states that we looked at under this survey, it was a survey about 1,262 fishers, none of the flag states were found to be entirely free from forced labor. And what we see is, really high spikes in certain countries within Asia, particularly China and Taiwan and Thailand. We did have a relatively small sample in China, so you have to recognize the limitations there. But indeed, what you see is quite high rates of forced labor across the industry. We did a little bit of a deep dive and looked at sort of the types of fishing where it's more likely that fishers are in situations of forced labor. What you see is all types of vessels. So usually there's a high focus on large commercial fishing vessels. In fact, what we see as well is small artisanal vessels. There are also situations of forced labor. Pretty consistently across the types of fishing being done, there are high rates of forced labor. The scoop net fishing number here is a little bit misleading because it was a fairly small sample, but I think the figure I would draw out here is long line fishing. And we know that long line tuna fishing on distant water fishing vessels has a particularly high rate of forced labor due to the nature of the fishing that's being undertaken there. And as you would guess, length of voyage does directly affect the likelihood of forced labor. So fishers who are on a vessel for over 6 months at a time, over 1/3 of them were in situations of forced labor. So that's a key factor as well in creating vulnerability to forced labor. So now I want to get into the core of what I wanted to talk about today, which is international labor standards for work and migration into the blue economy, into fishing work. So to provide a little bit of background, just in case anyone's not entirely familiar with how international labor standards are developed, the ILO develops international labor standards at our International Labor Conference every year, and they're adopted through a majority vote between governments, between employers, between workers. During the last century, we've actually developed 193 conventions, 209 recommendations, and Raphael actually stole my thunder here, but indeed the first convention back in 1919 was the 8-hour workday. That's one I'm sure many of you are very familiar with already. And what international labor standards really express, it's kind of the international consensus on what the labor standard should be for any specific aspect of work. In the most recent convention that we just, conference that we had back just in June, we developed a new standard related to the platform economy. So these standards, as new emerging issues develop in the world of work, the ILO develops new conventions to regulate them. There are two types of international labor standards. So when we talk about conventions, the key thing to keep in mind is that is a legally binding international treaty. When we talk about recommendations, those are non-binding guidelines on how to better implement international labor standards. So the ILO doesn't just adopt the standards, but we actually have what we call supervisory mechanisms that help to manage the implementation of them. So when a member state actually ratifies an international labor convention, they actually have to commit to applying those standards in good faith. And they do, in fact, have to commit to the supervision of the ILO. So we are a normative agency. We regulate both how the standards are developed, but also how they are implemented. So primary responsibility for supervision of the implementation of conventions lies with the Committee of Experts on the application of conventions and recommendations. So these are independent jurists. They're not ILO staff. And they, every year, receive reports from governments on how they are implementing ratified conventions. For conventions, the requirement is either 3 or 5 years, depending on the type of convention that governments have to report to the committee. And then when the committee reviews the report, they issue direct requests or observations to the responsible governments on how they feel the convention is being implemented. Sometimes there are issues of non-adherence, and the ILO will issue comments on how it's being done. The highest level of supervision for the ILO is what we call commissions of inquiry. And we recently, of course, had one in Myanmar in relation to the Conventions on Freedom of Association and Forced Labor. When a commission of inquiry happens, it is actually a very severe level of supervision, and it can ultimately lead to international sanctions against governments who are not adhering to the standards of various conventions. In terms of the process, in fact, complaints can be issued by quite a range of actors. So they can be issued by other member states of the ILO saying, another member state is not respecting this convention that they ratified, but as well, constituents of the ILO. So it can be also employers, workers' organizations, as well as the ILO governing body can make complaints about non-observance. As I said, we have almost 200 conventions at the ILO. It's quite a lot to keep track of. So what the ILO has said is, okay, there are all these conventions, they're all quite important, but in fact, we need to prioritize. So the ILO has set what we call 5 fundamental principles and rights at work, which are outlined in 11 fundamental instruments. And what we emphasize here is these are really the key conventions. You have to respect these conventions, even if you're not going to respect all 200 that the ILO has adopted. And importantly, they really have to be implemented in an integrated way. So it's not okay to say, yes, we've prohibited forced labor, but we're not going to allow freedom of association in our labor market. All of 5 of these principles have to be implemented in a cohesive and coherent way. And importantly, it doesn't in fact matter if ILO member states have ratified all of the underlying conventions. Just being a member state of the ILO means you have to respect these 5 fundamental principles regardless. So it's not a way of avoiding responsibility by not ratifying the conventions. And I would just stress here, we recently adopted a 5th principle in 2022, highly relevant to fishing work. Occupational safety and health has become the 5th principle. So all member states now have to pay more attention to occupational safety and health. I want to move on more directly to the standards related to fishing work. So wanted to share kind of the rationale behind why the Work in Fishing Convention, C-188, and its accompanying recommendation was developed in 2007. It was really to address the gap in labor standards that exist to ensure decent work in the fishing industry. So as many of you probably know, the Maritime Labor Convention had already been developed by the ILO, but the MLC explicitly excludes fishers. So fishers are not covered by MLC. They are separate standards for the two industries related to seafarers versus fishers. It was also because, of course, as has been said already, there are quite unique conditions of work in the fishing industry. It's not really easy to apply kind of the same standards that you would apply to factory work to fishing work. So we needed very specific standards to regulate work and living in the fishing sector. That, again, is things like isolated workplaces, hazardous work environments, unpredictable work hours. You really need specific standards. And finally, the last reason for developing the convention is we wanted to really expand coverage of fishers. There were some existing instruments, but they didn't cover all fishers and all fishing vessels engaged in commercial fishing. And particularly, we wanted to be sure small-scale fishers were covered. Small-scale fishers are actually the biggest part of the global fishing industry, and it's really important that their conditions are also regulated. The only exceptions here are for subsistence fishing and recreational fishing. All other types of commercial fishing are covered by the convention. So what does it do in terms of labor protections for fishers? Well, I do actually want to say it's not as comprehensive as the Maritime Labor Convention. So there is a little bit of a lesser degree of protections for fishers compared to seafarers. That's an important point to stress. But that said, it does do quite a lot. So there are some very concrete protections in C-188. It does prohibit any fees or related costs for recruitment or placement to be charged to fishers. Very important in eliminating conditions of debt bondage in the industry. It does set minimum age for work on board fishing vessels, and it requires special protections are in place for any fishers under 18 years of age. It does require regular medical examinations and standard employment contracts for fishers. In fact, the terms of those contracts are outlined in quite a bit of detail within the convention itself. It does require regular rest periods of sufficient duration to preserve the safety and health of fishers. So as Raphael mentioned, that is generally at least 10 hours of rest in any 24-hour period. It does require regular wage payments are made to fishers, as well as providing them the means to transmit their wages home to their families at no cost. This is a key issue for fishers because indeed wage theft and withholding of wages, very common form of abuse of fishers, and it was important to set standards for how often they should be paid. It does set minimum standards for accommodation and food on board vessels, including actually the quantity and nutritional content of food that's going to be provided to fishers, as well as, of course, safe drinking water. These are absolutely key issues because we know, of course, fishers can't just go and leave the vessel to get their meals. It has to be provided to them. It does set occupational safety and health requirements on board vessels, as well as the requirement of access to basic medical care. This is a key issue because what we see often is that, in fact, skippers may be reluctant to bring the vessel back to port when there is an injury or accident on board. They have to have access to at least basic medical care in case of an injury while they're at sea. And finally, last but not least, fishers must receive social protection coverage, no less favorable to that received by workers in other sectors of work. That is a key issue because indeed, as I said, it's a very hazardous type of work. A lot of injuries occur. In particular, workers' compensation mechanisms need to be in place for workers that do experience injuries. So where are we in terms of ratification? I think we have to be realistic. It's been a bit slow in terms of adoption of the Work and Fishing Convention. It was developed in 2007, and so far we've had about 27 ratifications of the convention to date. But I will say there is some momentum building in terms of ratification. So Thailand ratified, the first country in Asia to do so in 2019. This year we've had Solomon Islands in the Pacific, second country in Asia Pacific to ratify. The Work and Fishing Convention will come into force next year. And most recently, we had a very big announcement by Indonesia at the International Labor Convention that they are indeed ratifying the Work and Fishing Convention. That is a big deal because Indonesia has arguably the largest fishing fleet in the world. So it is an important step that they are ratifying the convention. I want to stress here that, in fact, the ILO doesn't just develop the conventions and say, yeah, consider ratifying. In fact, we provide quite a bit of direct support to our member states to encourage ratification. So we, of course, supported Thailand after the EU yellow card was in place to ratify the Working Convention in 2019. As I said, the first country in all of Asia to do so is a very big step for Thailand. More recently, on May Day, International Workers' Day, the president of Indonesia announced that Indonesia would be ratifying the convention. That was a very long process to get there, but we were very pleased that Indonesia has finally agreed to ratify. And for both of those processes, we were quite involved in providing technical assistance. So generally speaking, what we do is we'll do a gap analysis between the national legal framework and the articles of the Work and Fishing Convention to show what would be needed to support adherence. We do support advocacy among constituents for adoption of the convention, which was particularly important in Indonesia. There was a trade union consortium that was formed to support joint advocacy, and that was a big part of why Indonesia did agree to ratify the convention. We do provide technical comments when actual legislation is proposed to ratify the convention in national legislation. We do support sharing of good practices and lessons learned between countries that are interested in ratifying the convention. So particularly, we've shared between Indonesia and Thailand so that they can learn from each other on how to adopt the articles of the convention. And of course, we do, as the ILO, support social dialogue between governments, between workers, between employers to sort of further this objective of ratifying the convention. In Thailand, where ratification is, of course, quite a bit more mature, more advanced, we also actually facilitate engagement between governments and the observations of the committee of experts on how conventions are being implemented. So often this is sort of dense legal terminology that's being used in the observations. And so we do help sort of translate those observations for governments so that they can effectively respond. So what are the key requirements for states to ratify C-188? It does require a few things. And first and foremost, of course, it does require changes to national laws and regulations to ensure compliance with the articles of Convention C-188. This can be done in a couple of different ways. So Thailand, in fact, actually changed most of its legislation before formally ratifying the Work and Fishing Convention. Indonesia is taking a different approach where they've ratified and they say, okay, now we're going to take all the steps to change our laws and enforcement mechanisms to comply. They have about a year to do that before the convention comes into force next year. Either one is okay. We're supportive either way, as long as steps are being taken to ensure consistency. It does require identifying competent authorities, or in many cases, a variety of authorities. Of course, work in fishing is inherently a multidisciplinary area of regulation. So it often involves labor authorities, fisheries authorities, maritime authorities, all working together to regulate the industry. And it is important that a mechanism is in place so that they can all work effectively together. And last but not least, it does require establishing a system for compliance and enforcement of the articles of the convention. So it's not enough just to change the laws. They need to be implemented effectively. That requires flag state control, port state control, effective inspections of vessels, complaints procedures, and indeed setting up a system for valid documentation of vessels as well as their crews. So why would governments go through all this? Why? It sounds like a lot of work, right? Why would governments want to ratify? In fact, there are some very important hard and soft powers that the Work in Fishing Convention does offer. So increasingly, it is seen as the minimum standard for international trade in seafood, given there is this increasing emphasis on eliminating forced labor, human trafficking, and modern slavery. I think we will get to the place where if you have not ratified C-188, you're not going to be able to trade in seafood products anymore. It does provide some hard powers, of course, to authorities, so they can set clear labor standards for fishers. They have the ability to apply those standards to foreign vessels that come into their ports, and they can also require compliance with C-188 within MOUs that they might sign between countries of origin and destination for migrant fishers. It does also provide some soft power, so after a country has ratified, they actually have kind of more ability to negotiate for equal treatment of their migrant fishers in other countries' fleets. And as well, of course, it is quite important in terms of expanding labor inspection coverage for fishing vessels. This is a huge gap where vessels are inspected in relation to the fish, as Raphael mentioned, but not in relation to the work. Okay. So C-188 also has some flexibility clauses built right into it to encourage ratification. And importantly, there are some opportunities to exclude certain categories of fishers from coverage. That is generally for inland fishers. So for vessels operating in rivers, lakes, or canals, as well as certain categories of fishers related to that, they can be excluded from coverage from C-188. It can be implemented in a progressive fashion. So some of these things, medical certificates, crew lists, contracts, risk evaluations, OSH protections, those can be implemented over time. And generally speaking, if there are changes that are going to come in later, governments need to report that in their first report to the committee of experts. The accommodation requirements can be applied only to new vessels. And so that would mean, it doesn't necessarily require immediate retrofitting of the entire fleet of 1 million vessels. We know that is very challenging to accomplish. So over time, you have full compliance, but it doesn't require that all vessels immediately comply with the sort of structural standards around having accommodation on board vessels, with the exception of food and water, which has to be in compliance immediately upon ratification. You can also have less stringent requirements for smaller vessels, which the convention defines as those which are less than 24 meters in length. But I do want to stress here, all of these things have to be agreed upon through tripartite consultation. So it's not just that the government decides we don't want to comply with certain areas of the convention. If you do want to propose some level of progressive implementation, flexibility, it has to be discussed between governments, workers, and employers. And I did touch on this a little bit already, but in general, we do provide quite a bit of support in terms of ratification and implementation. So we actually have standards specialists both at HQ and the field who are ready to provide technical support if there are any questions about ratification. We do organize workshops, seminars, trainings, other capacity building events to support ratification and implementation of the convention. We do facilitate exchanges between ratifying states. Of course, every state is quite unique. Their fishing industry is quite unique. They can share from each other and learn from each other, how they have adopted the standards in C-188. We do, like my project, Ship to Shore Rights Southeast Asia, have technical cooperation projects to assist with implementation, both at national and regional level. So we cover most of Southeast Asia. We are also developing projects to cover the Pacific, as well as other projects to support implementation. And then, of course, the supervisory mechanisms are there on an ongoing basis to provide recommendations for further improvement of how the convention is being implemented. So just to conclude here, I did want to share a little bit of the operational guidance that's available from the ILO for implementing the Work in Fishing Convention. So we do have a training package that we've developed for labor inspectors to address the unique conditions of workers in the fishing industry. We do have guidelines on both flag state inspection as well as for port state control officers so that they can do their jobs effectively. We do have handbook on the detection of forced labor specifically in commercial fishing. So these are sort of very practical procedures that can be put in place by labor inspectors to identify cases of forced labor. And last but not least, just in November 2025, we developed guidelines for fair labor market services specifically for migrant fishers, because we know they are some of the most vulnerable fishers in the industry, and those are voluntary, but they do provide a lot of concrete guidance to various stakeholders in the fishing industry on how they can better protect the rights of migrant fishers. So I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harkins.